You guys have asked about this, and here's a quick crash course on one of the best openings for black against white's queen's pawn move known as the Slav defense. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and finally my Slavic accent is going to be useful for the video. Think of any great chess player that you admire, whether it is Carlsen, Kasparov, or Anand, or whoever. They probably played the Slav defense a lot in their life, because it is both solid and aggressive. And before I show you some variations, let me just also explain all the fundamental ideas, because I think it's going to be a lot easier for you to follow and to understand this whole concept. So first off, let's think about this position. White has just played pawn to c4, known as the Queen's Gambit, and it was called this way to fool black, to believe that it is actually a gambit and they can get a free pawn right here, because if black accepts it, white will happily play pawn e4, recapture the pawn on the next move, and end up with superior center. So if black doesn't want that, then they have to counter this move in some other way, and they need to maintain their center. There are two ways of going about this. The first way, the most classical, is known as the Queen's Gambit, where you play pawn e6 and defend the pawn this way. The drawback of this move is that you shut down your bishop and you cannot develop it actively after that. Alternatively, you can play the move pawn to c6 and guard the pawn this way. As you play c6, you leave this diagonal open for your bishop, therefore you can develop it later more actively. However, you obstruct development of your knight. So whether to play Queen's Gambit or the Slav defense depends on who you hate more, whether it is your bishop or your knight. On top of that, the Slav defense also contains one hidden aggressive idea. I'll just play some random move for white just to illustrate the point. If white plays whatever, at some point you can actually go ahead and grab this pawn on c4, and if white tries to play the standard move to get the pawn back, you can then solidify it with this pawn to b5 move, and now you have this rock solid pawn chain. You're up a pawn, plus this pawn on c4 takes away some space, and for example, white can no longer develop his bishop actively, and that would be really cool for you. Of course, in reality, your opponents are not going to play some silly moves. They're going to play something more meaningful, hopefully. Or not hopefully. What can they play? In most cases, they're going to just develop their knights, and we'll talk about that in a moment. What else could they play? Well, they can trade in this middle of the board, but this video is not for the faint of heart. Anyway, we'll talk about that in a moment. Basically, that leads to a dry and a bit drawish position, but I'll show you how to handle it as black. What if white ever tries to just push this pawn forward and gain the space this way? It is never a good idea for white, or I should say almost never, because you can easily counter this pawn by going b6, and after the trade, white only has spent some time and achieved nothing. They only activated your rook, and that is it. Realistically, at this point, both your opponent and you will horse around for some time, and then you're at the crossroad. The main move by black here is to snatch this pawn on c4. As we discussed earlier, that's one of the main ideas of the Slav defense. You can grab this pawn and later possibly even hold on to your extra pawn and also seize some space. We'll talk about that. Alternatively, some players prefer playing something like bishop f5. They hope to fool everyone and to play the London system as black. But the downside of this move, as you develop your bishop a little bit too early, white's got this idea to trade in the middle and to try to claim that your queen side is not defending well enough and you start having some problems. It's not the end of the world, but it's a little bit unpleasant, I should say. So let's come back. What else can you play? There is also this move pawn to e6, known as semi-Slav, as you somewhat haven't yet decided what opening do you want to play, whether it's the Queen's Gambit, or the Slav defense, so you ended up playing both. But the downside is, if you play this, your friends will tease you. They'll say if you play the semi-Slav, your wife will be semi-pregnant. It's not a good stuff. And instead, we'll go for the main line. Pawn takes c4. Now, you grabbed this pawn, and now you're ready to play pawn b5 on the next turn if white does nothing about that, and you'll end up with an extra pawn and potentially superior position. That is why the main move for white here is to prevent this move by going a4 themselves, so that you can't easily solidify this pawn on b5. Then, indeed, you should not and you cannot hold on to this extra pawn, and instead you should just develop. This time, you can actually use the advantage of the Slav defense, the fact that your bishop is not closed, and you can develop it. Not only you develop your bishop, but you also control this square twice, making it impossible for white to possibly push the pawn forward and to grab the center. Since white can't play a more ambitious move pawn to e4, in this case the pawn will simply be captured by you, they have to play a more modest move, pawn e3, hoping to get this pawn back on the next turn, and after this it's a pretty standard game. Both sides simply continue their development. White develops this bishop, you develop yours, as well as put this pin, let's say they castle, and then your plan is the same, to develop the knight, to castle kingside, and then you end up with the normal middle game position. If they play queen e2, threatening e4 to attack your bishop, you can certainly do nothing and just castle. Quite often black retreats the bishop in advance, not waiting for this e4 push, and then if white plays whatever, you castle kingside. Now you've got a very solid position. In the future you'll probably play something like queen e7 and e5, or maybe bring your knight to d5. All in all, you've got a very solid and good game, and objectively it's approximately equal. Back to the main line, there is also an aggressive gambit that your opponents may try against you. Once you snatch this pawn on c4, your opponents, instead of playing a4 to prevent your b5 move, they might play e4, which is a very ambitious move. They want to get the strong center, they want to get their pawn back and claim that they are superior. But of course, in this case, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to play the move pawn b5 and solidify this pawn on c4. Not only that, in the future, you will always have this idea of harassing your opponent by pushing the pawn forward and dragging this knight away. Moreover, in this case, you can also grab this pawn on e4 once the knight goes away from c3. Therefore, this move b5 in general is indeed very annoying for white for multiple reasons. Plus, they still cannot develop their bishop as they wish, so they have to do something very active. They have to claim that they have some initiative, some attack for the pawn that they sacrificed. That is why they play e5, attacking your knight. Of course, you have this excellent central square for your knight, so you just land it right here. And now they play a4, trying to pressure your pawn on b5. But you stay cool and play checkers. Now, as they take on b5, they calculated that they have two attackers against this pawn, so they hope that they destroy your pawn chain, but that's the moment when you say, hey, have you heard of Zug? And when your opponent is confused, you play this in-between move, knight takes c3, threatening queen, and then you're free to recapture this pawn on b5, but they no longer have the knight on c3, so they can't take this pawn, and you successfully outsmarted white. You still hold on to your extra pawn. Moreover, you undoubled it, and now you also have this great diagonal for your bishop. Your opponent still needs to play aggressively, so they go knight g5, the main move, and it is the moment when you play bishop b7 and your coach tells you, well done. You noticed that your opponent was going to play queen to f3 with this double attack to your king and this rook on b7, and you noticed that and made a strong prophylactic move combined with development, and you're like, yeah, that's what I meant. Anyway, after that they go queen h5, threatening checkmate right here. Of course, you stop that, the queen needs to go, and basically we can say that their attack failed. They didn't achieve anything. You can play bishop e7 so that your bishop controls these both diagonals, and you still have all the advantages of your position, an extra pawn, this great diagonal for your bishop, and your opponent frankly has nothing. They tried some attacking tricks against you, but nothing worked out. They can do something else. You can play h5 if you want and kick this queen further back. After queen g3, the only thing that you need to bear in mind is if your king side is a little bit weakened, you should be careful with casting right there. As in this particular case, it would be a bad mistake. White's got this knight takes e6 idea with the queen takes g6 follow-up, and you're actually done here. You just shouldn't castle right there because it's a little bit weakened. Instead, you can play bishop d5, and now you have this really monstrous chain, which is super solid. Plus, you have all the advantages of your position. You can just play knight c6, b4, a5, whatever. And basically, if in the future any tricksters would try to persuade you in investing in blockchain, crypto stuff, you can always say, you know, I've got a pawn chain, I'm good. If for some reason you don't want to go into the main line with pawn takes c4, there is also another system which became very popular in the recent years, known as Chebanenko variation, where black plays pawn a6. The move which is quite difficult to comprehend at first, as instead of developing or doing something meaningful, you play this mysterious pawn move on the side of the board. So what is the point? Well, on the one hand, it is an awaiting move. You just wait for white to do something. Maybe they're gonna take or do whatever, and it'll be easier for you to decide what to do next. Plus, maybe you even plan this little bit unexpected sort of crab attack on the queen side, which is gonna confuse everyone, yourself included. So it does make some sense, even though realistically, I don't recommend you too much to play this. Anyway, we're gonna talk about that quickly. Now, against a6, Prosk here played c5, just trying to control this weakness on b6, but amateur players usually play bishop g5, just playing a standard move, which is similar to the queen's gambit. They just want to develop, play e3, bishop d3, and, play all usual developing moves. Now, to this, you have another unexpected surprise, knight to e4. The move which puts some pressure on white and forces them to make a decision. In most cases, your opponents are going to come up with a bad decision. They're going to trade on e4. And this decision is bad, as after the exchange, they now have to still deal with another problem. This time, it's this knight on f3. And although it has a number of options of where to go to, they all are bad for different reasons. They can't just jump with this knight forward, because after f6, due to this double attack, they're going to simply lose one of these pieces. Alternatively, the knight could retreat back to d2, but in this case, it blocks the queen, and now you can grab this pawn on d4, and from there, maybe even the other one on b2, so it's also not that great for white. Finally, they can retreat back to g1, but as they do so, you can play h6, kind of saying, hey, do you want to play bishop c1 and try it again in the next game? But if they still insist on, playing on, then you've got g5, pushing the bishop further back, and after bishop g3, you play e5. So far, you've been pretty consistent in violating all opening rules, not developing anything, keeping your king in the middle of the board, and also exposing its position, but somehow you achieved a winning position. At this point, your opponent will likely become pretty excited and will say, hold my mouse, and I'm just gonna grab this pawn on e5. But to be honest, his position was already bad. And now you've got bishop b4, so that's why you sacrificed this pawn on e5. You just wanted to open a diagonal for your bishop. At this point, your opponent will start thinking, and to his horror, will realize that there is no other way to cover the king other than to give up the queen, which you're going to capture, and you end up with a totally winning position. Not only you're up a queen, but you keep attacking. Actually, you're going to play f6. As this bishop goes, you can grab this pawn, attack everything around, and it's totally winning. If your opponent is a type of a person who loves reading terms of service, he may go for the exchange slove. Back in the day, strong players played it only when they wanted to get a quick draw, as the position after that becomes pretty simplistic and dry. Nevertheless, a little bit later, I found some ways to cause a little bit of problems for black, so that white may still play it for a win, while basically having a draw at their disposal. So here I recommend that you go for a6. Why this move? If you keep repeating white's moves, then after these couple moves, white has a few ideas of how to create some little bit of problems for you. Maybe queen b3 attacking this pawn on b7, or maybe bishop b5 trying to exploit this pin, and then maybe knight e5. And of course, the position remains to be equal. It's nothing special, but nevertheless, now you need to be a little bit more precise in how you play after that. Instead of all that, I recommend that you go for a6, which just makes it a lot easier for black. Now you cover this square once and for all, meaning your opponent can never play knight b5 aiming for this trick, or in the future if they play e3, they can't ever develop their bishop to this square, so basically you keep it absolutely secure for yourself. Plus, you also made it a little bit of an awaiting move, and now once they play e3, you can throw your bishop out there to a more advanced square g4, where you pin their knight down to the queen, once again restricting their options. Now, most of your opponents will play bishop e2, which is a little bit passive for white and good for you, and then you just continue your development without mouse slips, hopefully, and then play bishop d6, trade their only active piece, and then you achieved an absolutely equal position where life's good, you're going to castle, put your rook to an open file, and chill. And if you want to know how to outplay your opponents in such simple positions and how to improve your positional understanding overall, check out this free masterclass up there, and I'll give you some simple actionable tips.